Hello, welcome to World Watch TV. I'm here with a dear friend of mine, Andreas Kraemer. Andreas is the director and the CEO of the Ecologic Institute in Berlin, one of the largest European think tanks on the environment, and like World Watch, one of the top 10 most influential think tanks. He's also chairman of the Ecologic Institute here in Washington, D.C. and a visiting assistant professor at Duke University, and he's wearing the Duke tie.
Oh, you spotted that.
That he's very proud of, I think. So, Andreas, what brings you to town?
I'm here in this week in New York City and in Washington D.C. mainly to talk about the reasons why Germany decided to phase out nuclear power and engage in that green power shift and what that means to the world. It's a lecture tour that is sponsored by the American Council on Germany, and they invest a lot in the bilateral relationship, looking always at the issues that are of salience either in the US or in Europe, Germany or both.
And what is the state of the phase-out in Germany? Where does Germany stand now?
Put it that way, it has been confirmed. Some people think that the nuclear phase-out was decided after Fukushima, that it was a reaction to the dangers that were articulated, to public pressure at that time, that there were electoral reasons. I think it's important to understand that the phase-out in Germany was decided in 1986 at Chernobyl.
Not after Fukushima. That's
No.
what usually is often portrayed in the papers.
And part of my role in doing this is to explain the long-term development of anti-nuclear sentiment and pro-renewable investment that has driven Germany's energy policy in consensus across the political board, from the left to the right, from the green to the pro-business people, doesn't matter. Many people supported this. Essentially what happened in the 1970s during the oil crisis, Germans, like Americans, decided that they wanted to have an alternative to oil at that time, so they invested into the research of alternative energies. We didn't call it renewables then, we called it alternative energies. So in the 1970s, like the US, Germans wanted to have the option of those alternative technologies. In 1986, after Chernobyl, they decided that they wanted to have anything but nuclear. Very large proportions of the German population, majorities of each of the electorates for each of the political parties, wanted to get out of nuclear power. They didn't know how to do that. It took them about 5 years, and then in 1990 they adopted the Stromeinspeisegesetz, is the German term. It is usually translated as the feed-in tariff, which is not a nice term. But I ask you this, where would the US be today if in 1990, 20 years ago, Republicans with a capital R, owning large tracts of land, owning water rights, owning hydropower dams in the Mountain West, had persuaded the federal legislature to give them I call it the Independent American Power Act, that would force utilities to give access to the grids to those people who generate renewable energy, feed it in and be paid a fair price. If 20 years ago that had started with a cross-party consensus, in Germany, after 1990, for a decade, we built up the renewable energy industry, wind, solar, hydropower, but also bioenergy. After that decade, in 2000, the then German federal government negotiated a voluntary negotiated phase-out of nuclear power plant, allowing the nuclear power plant owners to operate the plants to the end of their technical life, allowing them to produce a certain amount of power from each of those plants, and then they would have to be retired. It wasn't quite clear when the last one would go off the grid. It was always assumed to be between 2021 and 2023. It depends on a number of assumptions. Mm-hmm. That decision was taken 10 years after the first introduction of our feed-in tariff and 10 years or a decade before Chernobyl. After Chernobyl, what German government did is simply restate, confirm that nuclear phase-out and fix the endpoint to the 31st of December 2022, that is in the middle of the range that was previously under discussion. So in that sense, there was great continuity and cross-party consensus in that decision to phase out nuclear power and to invest in the build-up of renewable energies instead.
So here in town, I know this from my own conversations, people look at what happens on the other side of the Atlantic in Germany with the phase out of the nuclear power plants with a lot of skepticism. And they believe that this will possibly lead to tragical blackouts and all the economic problems that follow a blackout. What are the first experiences, and do you expect blackouts by 2020?
Definitely not. Germany, after Fukushima, basically overnight, it took 3 days, 4 days, turned off 7 nuclear power plants, the oldest ones, the least secure ones. They were turned off. That was a little bit of stress in the system. It hadn't been planned beforehand as a strategy exercise. But what we found is that the European grid very quickly found its balance again without those 7 nuclear power plants.
So that means that more electricity was then imported?
Partly more imported, partly more generated, partly coal-fired power plant. You didn't actually see a significant switch to nuclear power coming from France. You didn't see a massive switch anywhere. Basically, sort of the fall out of the system of 7 nuclear power plants in Germany. Yes, it was not something that the electricity traders wanted to do, but it was something that actually could be accommodated. It's important to remember that Germany has electrical interconnections to all its 9 neighbors. Germany is not isolated, it's embedded in the European energy system, and in a way that provides security. Germany has been a net exporter of electricity for more than a decade. Germany was a net exporter of electricity last year, in 2011, with the turn-off of the nuclear power plants and with the phase-out that has been decided. And the forecasts are that Germany will remain a net exporter of electricity for at least another decade. After that, it becomes a little bit more hazy, but scenarios over 10 years is that Germany remains in that exporting role.
Very interesting. So these are 7 reactors that have been shut down, as you say, basically overnight, without the major impacts on the grid. That's good news. Now, 7 out of how many in total is that?
To answer your question, Germany has 17 nuclear power plants. 1 was switched off already for basically safety reasons. It was regarded as unreliable. 7 were shut off immediately. In addition, and this is a story
that's almost half of the existing power plants.
It gets better, because after that, another 5 reactors in May after Chernobyl, just 2 months after Chernobyl, were coming up for their regular maintenance schedules. And they were not delayed. They all shut down for regular maintenance. So for a few weeks in May of last year, Germany was down to 4 out of 17 nuclear reactors. And that was something that happened without a hitch. Also, a few weeks ago in December, we had this cold spell in Europe. At that point, the situation in the European power grid was such that France could not produce enough nuclear power, mostly in France, to heat its own homes. So Germany delivered 3 gigawatts of power across the border during that time, and we still had 7% of spare capacity sitting idle in Germany. Germany is in a comfortable situation in the sense that we're embedded in the European grid, which gives us security and we can trade at any point in time. And those are economic decisions, but at the same time we have a huge overcapacity in the electricity system, and that is a margin that it has allowed us in the past to be a net exporter of electricity, but it has allowed us last year to turn off some of that overcapacity and still have ample margin to operate.